Drake, we were talking about what a wild world college football is right now, and the Big Ten and SEC trying to make moves that could potentially allow them to take full control of the sport and the playoff landscape. Yeah. And, Utah and a lot of these other schools, they might have to resort to drastic actions, Drake, in order to avoid it.
Why sit around and wait for the SEC and the Big Ten and honestly the NCAA president Charlie Baker to create this ultimate league of the super teams in college football? Charlie Baker's whole deal the last 6 months has been, what if we take the schools that can afford to pay their student athletes $30,000 a piece for at least half of those athletes and give them their own league where they create their own rules? It's a very vague attempt for the NCAA to still try to have some power here. And it doesn't sound like the Big Ten, the SEC, or even a Florida State, some of these major brands are very happy with the NCAA. Shocking, I know. In that, we've heard all these talks about how those conferences, those teams might break away and try to do their own thing, leave the NCAA. What if the ACC, the Big 12, the teams that are considered the leftovers are at the forefront of this, or at least progressive in the future of college athletics? Here's what I mean. Right now, I'm talking about UNC and Virginia being two teams that are pretty good players in expansion because their TV markets make sense for the SEC. But the rumors we keep hearing are Virginia Tech and NC State, who are considered, or Virginia Tech and NC State, who are considered the little brothers, are the ones who are actually pioneering going to the Big 12 or pioneering going to another conference. What if those are the schools that make the decision and say, hey, I want to go XYZ? And then the actual government of Virginia says, well, we got to keep you with UVA. Why don't you guys go together, right? That's going to complicate things. It is Virginia Tech laying it all on the table and saying, look, we will not be truffled with, to quote Michael Scott. And if you're the Big 12, if you're the ACC, there comes a point where you say, look, we're not going to live on the whim of the Big 10 and the SEC who don't want us to be here. At what point do we actually separate and this becomes a league of its own where you guys get to play Michigan, Ohio State every other weekend and get your viewership, and the Big 12, the ACC, can actually have the product that people will watch because the parity still exists? We are undervaluing parity in college athletics right now, and I think that's going to be the death of what we know as the fun, the pomp, the circumstance that is college football.
You're right. I mean, it's nice to know, like, each season, before this season, we were talking about Utah having a shot to make the college football playoff. I know I was. And yes, when we found out about Cam Rising and even this, with how good the Pac-12 this year, I didn't feel like Utah was going to make it, but I felt like there was at least a chance. Like, that's what makes it fun, is like your school has a chance to win it all. The surprise, the shock, like, I knew Michigan. A lot of people thought Michigan would be good this year, but even they're another example. And yes, I know they're in the Big Ten machine now, and have been, but like they weren't expected to win it all. Like the parity is what we talked about. Like just the story of what they represent. Of they're not Georgia, they're not Alabama, and boom, now they won a national. Like there's other teams at TCU making it there is such a win, as we talked about. Like that's what makes this fun as well. And if the top dogs want to shut it off and not allow for that, I think that's where it would be really disappointing. And that's where I would want these schools to separate and be able to keep alive this sport that we love to cover so much, because there's so much about it that is changing so rapidly, Drake.
There's part of this to me too, where it's appalling how women's basketball has been treated by the national media, in the college game especially. They don't get the attention until the last couple of years that they've truly deserved. Yeah. They are treated as second rate. And to be honest with you, JT, looking at the last even 2 seasons, there has been more and more focus on women's basketball, more ESPN picking up their March Madness games, and people care about Caitlin Clark. People care about this product that was for so long considered second rate. When these big TV companies decide what's first rate, what's second rate viewing, they don't always get it right. They're going to tell you that Michigan, Ohio State is this first rate viewing, and that BYU and Utah will never be first rate to that extent. I think when we get to the point where Fox buys out the SEC, the Big Ten, and says, look, create your Super League. We'll have the rights to it. Here's $1 billion. That sounds crazy, but it's legitimately what's on the table in a lot of these conversations. Here is a blank check. Go do your own thing. In that world where ESPN picks up the ACC and the Big 12, I still think when top 10 Utah plays top 15 BYU, you're going to see eyeballs on this. will consider this a second-tier product. Like we considered women's basketball in the college game a second-tier product. And then the day that a star shows up for Utah, the way that a Caitlin Clark has, you think, wait a second, this is a whole lot better than we actually considered it to be. And then the egg's on whose face? Again, I believe when we as the Big 12, the expansion Big 12, get ahead of the game here, it's only going to put us in a better spot. Don't just try to ride the coattails of the SEC and the Big 10, hoping there can be a Power 3 one day.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like that's the world we're going to come into like that. I mean, when people say super conferences in general, they usually do only refer to the two, being the SEC and the Big 10 as well. And that's where you see the Big 12 already making moves, right? Some of the scheduling things where they've tried to avoid some of the SEC and the Big Ten's bigger matchups, rivalry weekend, things of that nature, where they're trying to like place a Utah BYU in early November, maybe to try and give that rivalry a little bit of a spotlight. But then even then, I think it's Alabama LSU that weekend. So it's hard to get out of the way of some of those things too. But you're right. It definitely does feel like that's what we're trending towards. And it is such a bummer that in the national, we see this in the national media at times too. Like I just remember people, even when Utah back in 2019 was really good that year and they were vying for a college football playoff spot all year long, and everyone was like, well, how good is Utah really, and all this and that. And Utah was really good that year. Like, yeah, they lost to Justin Herbert's Oregon in the Big 12, the Pac-12 championship game at the time. And it's one of those things where that team was 11-1 going into that game for a reason. They were really good, and they deserve. Look, this isn't and that wasn't an Alabama or a Florida State instance. Excuse me, where like the star quarterback gets hurt. Now we got to reevaluate everything. Like everyone was still there and healthy. Like when you put together that resume and your complete team is still there, you deserve an opportunity to prove that. As for the third and final time, I will bring up what TCU did to Michigan back just last year's playoff.
Yep. And then Michigan wins a national championship. Like TCU didn't beat a slouch here, and I understand that the loss to Georgia is something people will bring up constantly, but you look at the one team, the dominant team in college for those 2 years was Georgia, right? They were the anomaly. It was like, oh, well, it's Georgia. They're mowing through everybody, especially that season. And we have seen those juggernauts and superpowers in college football. Not to say that TCU could ever have held the Bulldogs jockstrap, but they beat Michigan. There is still an avenue for Utah to beat Ohio State in the college football playoff. And what we are hearing is people thinking that's impossible. People think it's impossible that a Kansas State could ever beat a Penn State in the college football playoff. And there is no way, again, there's no way to truly understand how undervalued Parity is until we get 5 years down the line and everything's ruined. And we look back and say, I miss when Kansas State played Missouri in the non-conference. Those were fun games.
I 1000% agree. It's something that definitely feels like, especially non-conference games, where we're getting away from non-conference games in terms of the big ramifications of them, the big ones. But one thing that is not going away is expansion, and want to talk about an aspect of Big 12 expansion with all of you in one moment. But first, want to talk to you about one of the sponsors of today's crossover in our great friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. You can bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. And the NBA is back from the All-Star break. Steph Curry is going to be getting back at it. Can the Warriors make a playoff run to get out of the play-in realm? And are they going to be able to do that? What are we going to see from the likes of Eastern Conference contenders? So many fun trades, so much great action going on across the association. And you can bet on all of it now at FanDuel Sportsbook.